Hey, hey, full stack. Welcome to my Netflix comedy special. Just kidding. But I'm sure you'd all stream that if it happened. So we're getting close to lunch. We have one more talk before we take a little break. We're going to touch on my favorite subject, my favorite subject when it comes to tech, open source. How many people are open source developers? Go on, let's see. How many people are open source developers? Woo, all right. Clearly you're developers. At any rate, there's some interesting things about open source. It's kind of a gray area in some ways. Open source doesn't always mean free, and open source doesn't always mean better. And to kind of address those issues, we have a wonderful speaker coming up. He's going to talk about how what we can learn from open source is great collaboration and how to make better things. So please welcome the Chief Data Officer of LinkedIn, Igor Perisic.
Thank you. Most of you have been sitting for a little while, so I'm going to ask you to do a very strenuous exercise to start. Can you raise a hand? The right or the left one? You get to choose. Just raise one. OK. Now that I know that you can raise a hand, put it down again, please. I'm going to ask you some questions. And since I know you can raise hands, please answer them. So the first one is, are you using social networks in a semi-regular basis? Let's say maybe a couple of times a week. And things such as, let's say, Instagram, Facebook, Twitter, or dare I say LinkedIn, please raise your hand. Yes. Keep it up. Keep it up. For the recalcitrant few that did not raise your hand, are you using an Android device, whether it's a phone or a watch? Raise your hand. Keep it up. Keep it, no. I know it's a strenuous exercise. You're going to keep it for a little while. OK? OK, let me do another try. If you like playing games, and some of, let's say, most recent famous games, like Fortnite, Clash of Clans, Candy Crush, I don't know, please raise your hand. Keep it up. So my exercise here, if you look around, there's tons of hands that are raised. So the first myth that I wanted to debunk is that we don't do anything useful or at scale or with any value through open source, because all of these are based on open source software. So that's the first myth that I'd like to debunk. The second one is nothing critical within your own stack is actually built using open source. And that one, without knowing what the others are doing, I can give you an example about LinkedIn. Most of our traffic is coming from the mobile client. So if it's Android, then check, we're done. If it isn't, well, the framework itself, the presentation framework, we're using Play. And for JavaScript, we're using Ember. Both of them are open sourced. OK? Once a signal hits our data center, the first thing it hits is Apache traffic server. It's our L0 level, figuring out where you need to go to route the traffic. That's open sourced. Then it goes through a myriad of microservices internally. And the way that it communicates across is through an RPC mechanism, which we call RESTly, open sourced. RESTly lies above Avro, open source as well. So the way that we communicate between services is open sourced. If you go further back into, say, more data-intensive services, backend services or stateful services, our search engine, the core of it is Lucene, open source. We build up a distributed database. The core of it is MySQL, open source. Our messages are flowing through Apache Kafka, open source. We have a streaming ability on our top of messaging PubSubQ, Apache Samza, open source. If you look at the picture, at that level, communications between two services or event flows are using open source technology at LinkedIn. There's nothing more critical than this. If you cut these two things off, we can't communicate between services. We can provide the experiences that you're enjoying. Even more than this, then after that, we go back to our processing data centers, where we build up intelligence and things of the sort. Well, Hadoop, open source again. And you might think then, well, but that's just a file storage. Not really. We're building all our AI on top of it. which is also open source. So without open source, you wouldn't be able to use LinkedIn, neither would you be able to use all these other applications that I mentioned. So we're doing things that are very valuable with open source. If you think about it, we've come a long way from the beginning. Tim Berners-Lee told us some days ago that the internet was just invented 30 years ago, when open source actually is about roughly 35 years ago. It's not that long. And yes, maybe the most known project is Linux, that Linus Torvalds built. But before that, you had Richard Stallman, GNU, and Free Software Foundation, et cetera, et cetera. And even if you were around in the software industry around the 2000, the beginning of 2000, you would still talk to venture capitalists and businesses who would tell you, I'm not too sure about this open source thing. What is it really good about? Is it going to stay? Is it going to survive? Or not? Contrast this with the picture today, and this is only numbers from GitHub. They just release on a yearly basis, they do the state of GitHub, the Octoverse. There's about 31 million contributors on GitHub. There's 31 million software engineers that contribute code through open source to GitHub. 31 million. That's a huge jump. Not only this, but you have roughly more than 2 million organizations that contribute, that are represented through these engineers, and gazillions of repositories. The thing that I like from this is these 31 million developers, it's actually recognizing that software engineering is actually a communal exercise. You never really code on your own. You never really learn everything on your own. Patterns, you learn from other code that you look at. You learn from discussion with other software engineers. And that's how you grow. That's how you become better as a software engineer. This 31 million is actually recognizing the fact that we are really just one community. The other interesting fact to look at is who are these biggest contributors to open source? And this number is from 2017, because I didn't want to bias it after Microsoft acquired GitHub. But you look at the top two. The x-axis is number of engineers, if you want, and the y-axis is the number of repos. The two top ones are not necessarily companies that were known from the beginning as big open source contributors. You could argue that Microsoft was the quintessential closed source software engineer. Today, it's the biggest contributors. Google at the beginning did not open source a lot of their projects. Case in point, Hadoop is actually from a paper that Google published, not from the code that Google shared. Yet today, the biggest contributors. So we've come a long way. If we've come a long way, you can ask yourself, if this is what we mean by open source, all these contributions, why do you want your organization to participate? And why continue since everything is available already? Right? I can just pick up stuff and it works. So why continue? Well, from the perspective that I want to share with you, it's on one side, open source has opened up the doors for your creativity to be able to iterate very rapidly to build up useful applications. From a software engineering perspective, that's still true for developing better abilities in how to code, better SDLC, software development life cycles, and opening door into how we think about just the entire process. So let me walk through a little bit at a high level how we think about coding, right? At the beginning, you have a problem. And this is in a situation where it's not just a bug fix, that you have a ticket that you go and fix. And the first question you should ask yourself, well, do I extend something that exists, whether it's within your company? Is there a service that exists within my company? I can just extend it. I may not have ACRAs. I may not be able to approve my ticket, but still, can I extend it and somebody would then do the RB and approve it? So I'm extending that thing, whether it's internal or external. And if it doesn't exist, then go ahead, build it. And that's already a good approach to it. Do a little bit of due diligence. Once you decide to build it, well, join the open source community. And once you get into the open source community, you get a community to participate with you. And usually there are little things that can happen there, where it may be that your software that you've built it stagnates. You may even move away from it. And in that case, just put in an attic someplace so people know that it's not necessarily an active project. So they don't necessarily build from it, or if they're interested into it, they can be owners of the project and move it on. Or your software can flourish. It seems to be hitting a spot. It seems to be gathering a community around it. Everybody's happy about it and building more, which may not last forever. And if it doesn't last forever, moving down to the attic. And that's what happened with Project Voldemort at LinkedIn. Or it can hit escape velocity. And that's what happened with Apache Kafka, which then became a spin-off of LinkedIn in a company called Confluent, because it actually fit a nice place that's missing in what is available for you to use. So think about it in that perspective. And then what does it mean to build better engineering practices? It's actually, I think, a fallacy to think that all engineers start from a blank piece of paper, a clean slate, and start coding something new. Most of your time actually is you have a ticket, you need to fix a bug, or most of your time it's maybe extending a project, and very rarely it's building something from scratch. Which means that the first thing you do when you get a ticket is what? Well, you look at the ticket, what is it that I need to fix? What is it that's broken, and what is the feature that I need to add? The next thing is you're going to look at the code. We always say the code doesn't lie, so it should be very explicit. Well, that can be very hard to read, especially if you didn't write it. To reason through all the abstraction and layers in the code is not necessarily that much straightforward. So documentation matters. And open source can teach you really, really rapidly here, because now the person who's going to look at your code doesn't sit next to you, doesn't even sit in the next building. It can be on another planet speaking in another language. Hence, the documentation should be really well done. If you take that perspective, internally, it pays off, because now even your own internal code is well documented. Yes, maybe the person sits next to you, but still it's well done, because the practices that you've learned from open source translate internally. It certainly improves due diligence, because now you can think about how you're going to build software by looking what is out there and extend it, as I mentioned before. It certainly improves packaging, because you may have some idiosyncrasies that are internal, that if you want to open source, you need to remove that, which means that you need to build the right abstraction layers and the right interfaces. That much better to operate later on. And you have a clear sense of functionality. I'm going to build a project and tell you exactly what it is. I'm not going to be misleading you. This is what this project is. Kafka is a PubSub messaging queue. And therefore, you can build something around it. And when you do, what carries with you is, as an engineer, your reputation. I wrote the code. Now it's visible to the rest of the world. I cannot hide behind the anonymity of being within an enterprise. It also carries the reputation of your engineering organization or your team. So you're going to do a better job at reviewing that code. Because internally, we all know that we're hitting some deadlines or timelines. Oh, I need to fix this bug before I go home, or I fix this bug before something. Why don't you just approve it very quickly? Don't worry about it. It seems to work. And the RB is just automatic almost. That's not necessarily the case with open source. The pull request is going to be reviewed, and reviewed very well. And in the end, what you've built is a software that is much more resilient. Because if you build it with open source, if there's a bug because suddenly somebody is using your software in a different environment, doing slightly different things, if it's open source, what will happen? What is the difference between closed source and open source in this case? Well, in the open source environment, they'll fix it and they'll give you a pull request. In the closed source environment, it's a support ticket. And that's a cost. That's an opportunity. So that much more, the better for you. The other door that's opening that I feel very strongly these days, it's the door between transferable skills and productivity. And that's an interesting one because it's combined the individual and the enterprise. What do I mean by this? Every software engineer starts at some point of time by graduating from someplace, whether it's high school or college. You're going to get your first job. That first job is not going to last forever. Then you're going to go to the second job, third job, and through your career, you migrate from company to company. If that company is using open source software, well, that's a transferable skill, because as you go to the next one, they might be using it as well, and that's a skill that you can directly use. If they don't, it's a pattern that you understand, which is already good, but it's not directly productive from the company's perspective. For example, if you're using your closed-source search engine, you know what an inverted index is, you know how to deal with compression, you know that for search, usually query understanding matters. But as you move to another company and you're part of the search team again, and they've implemented that completely differently, you understand what it's supposed to be doing, but going through the code is going to take you a little while. If it's built on open source, you go to the other company, you're immediately productive because you can understand the code. You know what it does. Transferable skill for you as a developer, productivity for you as a company. A match made in heaven. So I've covered that open source is actually opening the doors through a lot of things. One is enabling you to create products that matter, to do so in a very efficient way. It's also opening the door to better understand the software development lifecycle and teaching individuals to be better at their craft, which is software engineering. And it's opening the door to thinking about the careers of individuals and a career path. But to close, I'd be remiss to not mention clouds. And my argument in the cloud environment that all the things that I've told you actually applies directly. There's not that much difference. Satya used to say, or still saying, first party is third party. And it took me a while since I'm new to Microsoft to really understand what he meant. And what it is really saying is, well, internally, when a company is big enough, it's already almost an open source environment. I build a service, somebody somewhere else in a different building is going to use it. Well, it's almost like an open source project, but it's entirely internal. And now you can see in clouds, well, but wait a minute, if I can provide this service internally, why won't I provide this service to individuals who are going to use my cloud offering? There's no difference. First party, third party, same thing. If you build it from the beginning. A while ago, Jeff Bezos used to mention that in saying, your internal API are your external APIs. Don't go and re-implement wrappers around your APIs. You try to figure out what's going on, and now you have a nightmare to maintain. So in the cloud space, it's the same. Open source, just going to open door to enable you to be very creative into building applications very quickly. Thank you.